But what if I don't want them?
Well, sometimes we don't want them. Sometimes we don't want
I
them.
was just
But
being
everybody
realistic, I
wants to
guess.
talk about contracts. Who would not want to talk about contracts? I can't even imagine the person who would not want to spend their afternoon talking about contracts. We love contracts. Actually, we do like contracts a lot. Look at Stephanie. She said minors wouldn't because they can't sign one. Look at that. Well, technically, they could sign one. It just wouldn't be enforceable. Ah, there you go. See, um, contracts really are and should be like one of our favorite topics because at the end of the day, without contracts, we don't get paid.
Right.
Agency agreements are contracts, and without those, we can't even be hired by somebody in a transaction, and we certainly can't get paid. And ultimately, even if we have an agency agreement, unless we can produce another type of contract, we're probably still not going to get paid. And so, I think contracts is really kind of low key, like overlooked as like it should be a fun topic, just because you got to understand how contracts work so you can make sure you make any money in this business. And
I actually do like the topic of contracts.
it's you know what, it's a very I find it is similar to finance in this way. It is very useful in the real world to train yourself to think how a contract works. Is very different because most people come into this class and they've heard expressions like sign a contract, or they've talked about signing contracts, or they've signed them, or but they've never really thought about what that means. I think sometimes there's this perception that there's like the contract police that are going to fall out of the sky and make people do things that are in contracts, but it just doesn't work that way. So we really have to.
That's true. Like we have already talked about a couple contracts. We've talked about a promissory note, which is just a contract between a borrower and a lender. We've talked about an agency contract, which is just an employment contract between a client and a broker. And now we get to talk about the contract that we actually came here to make money off of.
That's it. Most of you did not come in here thinking of a contract as like a listing agreement or buyer agency agreement. Most of you, when you heard contract coming in the door, you were thinking more traditionally about like the contract on a property, the contract between the buyer and the seller themselves, the contract between the landlord and tenant themselves, the actual agreement about the property. And that's the contract that we really are going to focus on here in Unit 8. But remember that contracts function the same. A contract always has the same basic definition. And it is the first three words that are the most important. Absolutely. A legally enforceable promise. It's a legally enforceable a contract's not just a promise between two parties. A contract is a legally enforceable set of promises. In other words, if the two parties try to break that promise, who would back that promise up? Who might step in and say, no, this promise needs to be followed? What do we mean by legally enforceable? What do y'all think? Courts. That's exactly right. A contract.
Favorite things about this, I'm so glad that you used that definition, and I forgot that it was there because I was thinking to myself, we make promises with people every single day. And I think because of the way the class is structured, even I have been a quote unquote victim of this, like I'm looking at like, okay, there's standard language in a contract, so that must mean there's always going to be a definitive way to handle things. Well, just like we have all kinds of different promises that we make to people that are very different every time we make them, so are contracts. So
what a great point. That's exactly right. A contract is whatever the two parties agree to it. There is no such thing as a standard contract in the sense that you have to use this. If the two parties want to go out on a limb and have wild promises with each other, they probably can. And contracts are all around us all the time. And so we have sales contracts between buyers and sellers. We have the agency contracts between our clients and our office. We have leases between landlords and tenants. Promissory notes, as Seth mentioned earlier, between lenders and borrowers. Even look at that last one down there. independent contractor agreements between brokers and their offices. How many of you think you're going to probably need a contract with whatever office you end up hanging your license with, so that you know what your commission split is going to be and how much you're going to get paid on transactions and what you have the authority to do and what you don't have the authority to do? So you're going to have a contract with your office. So there's contracts everywhere.
When we talked about agency before, Travis has always been like, we're not talking about compensation. If we really want to talk about it, it's the firm that gets it. We never talked about how it gets to the broker.
Correct.
So that's just an example of how to secure it. You need a contract.
And the art of contracts is not understanding these are promises between people, because as Seth mentioned a second ago, promises are cheap. I mean, promises are a dime a dozen. People make promises all the time. The question is, have they made a promise that is enforceable in a court of law, or have they simply made a cheap promise that nobody can really do anything about? That's the art of a contract. And what we're going to talk about in this section in particular is, how do we take a promise between two parties, any two parties, and make that promise legally enforceable? Make it so that if a lawsuit were to happen, the court would actually look at the agreement and say, I don't care what you say or what they say. I'm looking at an agreement, and this agreement says otherwise. So you're going to follow this agreement. That doesn't magically happen. We have to follow rules to get to a point. How many of you think there are certain agreements that a judge would look at and go, I don't really care what this says because it's not done correctly. Get the hell out of my face. How many of you think that happens in courts of law every single day? Right?
Judge Judy.
Absolutely. And so what we are here to avoid is that very scenario. We are here to avoid a situation where a judge looks at an agreement and goes, I can't do anything with this. Because at the end of the day, if a judge won't do anything with it, if they won't enforce it, then we were wasting our time even having an agreement.
Absolutely. So you need to know from a test taking point of view, like what defines a valid agreement, as well as in the real world. Like if you see something that your client is filling out and something might be incomplete or they done something wrong, you need to be able to point out. And I know that sounds more cliche than necessary, but really there's simple things that would absolutely render a contract
meaningless,
not useful,
completely not useful. And that's the things we want to avoid. What we're here to learn are the rules, not what the parties are going to negotiate between each other necessarily, but how they do that in a way that a court would say, you know what, we're going to make you follow this agreement. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, that's why we have people sign contracts anyway. We have people sign contracts not because we expect them to follow the contract. We don't need a contract if people follow it. We need a contract if people don't follow it, so that we can hold them accountable. And I've always loved this expression in our business. You know, people will put a contract in front of you and go, oh, I trust you so much. No, you don't. You would never put a contract in front of me if you trusted me.
Right.
Because what is the whole purpose of a contract, folks? To hold somebody responsible when they do what?
Don't trust.
When they mess up, when they break their promises. And so
it's like when somebody's putting a prenup in front of you.
That's
like,
exactly what it is. You know, like, oh, we're gonna have a prenuptial agreement, but baby, I love you and trust you to the end of the earth. No, you don't. No. And that's okay too. You probably shouldn't. But that's the truth. It can't be both. Contracts are not about trust. Contracts are about distrust. And how we would settle that distrust. Because one thing is certain, if a contract ends up in court, the two parties are going to disagree about what that contract says. Otherwise, it wouldn't be where?
In court.
In court. And so it's going to be then up to a judge or a jury to decide what that agreement actually does convey and what those promises are. Now, so what are we expected to do? Because I got to get your mind in the right mindset of what our role is here when it comes to contracts, because they are all around us. Just like everything else, we have to treat our clients different than our customers when it comes to contracts as well. One of the things that I think throws people off on the test a lot is you'll see a statement like this. It'll say, Corbin is helping a buyer write up an offer on a property. Let me ask y'all a question. Does that mean Corbin necessarily represents that buyer? What do y'all think?
No.
Oh.
No, because helping someone write up an offer is a function that we can offer to who?
Client and customer.
Clients or customers.
That's part of honesty and fairness. We need to be fair.
That's exactly
you want to
right.
write up an offer? You tell me what you want me to put on that offer.
Right.
But don't ask me if I don't represent you what you should put on there.
So I'm going to write the word helping here or assisting. That's not advice. Helping or assisting means explaining the terms of the contract, explaining, well, what does an earnest money deposit do? That we do for both customers and clients. We assist with contract preparation for everybody. That means if somebody shows up in front of us and they want to make an offer, we have the ability to do what?
Help them.
Help them. No matter whether they're a client or a customer. Is everybody clicking in on that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. Now, that is very different than what we do for clients when it comes to that document. When it comes to client, here's the difference. Let's say that Tanya is a buyer customer who comes to one of my open houses. And she says to me, you know what? I think I want to make an offer. First of all, would I tell her to get out of my face because you're not my client? Or would I say, you know what, Tanya, I'd be glad to help you with that?
Happy to help.
Of course, you're going to say, get out of my face. No.
Tanya, I'd be happy to help.
Let me help you.
Absolutely. I would be
different.
Be happy to help you with that. And so when I pull out the 11-page agreement, first thing I'm going to start doing is explaining the agreement to her, because it's not fair to her to sign an 11-page agreement that she has no idea what it means. Does that make sense for everybody?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's
I think
just
we can
fairness.
all say that we've probably signed something that we have not read before. And that's also why this section is important.
And so an explanation is owed to everybody. Are we good so far? Right? We explain things to everybody. Now, but there will come a point in time at some point as we go through when I'm explaining, oh, well, this is the earnest money deposit, which is the amount of money that you put into a trust account in case you don't follow through to make the seller feel better and whole about the fact that you breached the contract. That's explaining. That's not advice. That's helping.
You might go further in depth with your client.
Well, here's Tanya's question. And remember, she's my customer. Here's Tanya's question. Well, how much of an earnest money deposit should I do? If she's a customer,
I can't help you with
that is a line that does not get crossed. Does everybody see the difference?
Yep.
Yeah.
Because she's not asking me how an earnest money deposit works or what an earnest money deposit is anymore. What's she asking me?
For advice.
For advice about what she should put on that agreement as an earnest money deposit. However, let's say Madison is my buyer client who wants to make an offer on that same property. If Madison is my buyer client, not only would I explain the document to her, would I tell her, well, and I think this is what you should do for an earnest money deposit. I think this is what your offer price should be. Do I owe that to my client?
Yes.
Yes. What the repercussions are if you do this.
Yep.
You make, like, to a client, you want to be able to say, you need to be comfortable with the amount of money that you're going to lose. So, but you would not tell that to a customer.
What it.
Because that's advice. Now, we're just reminding just a second for what Travis said when we were talking about Tanya, who's the customer. What would Travis's agency relationship be to Tanya? Helping a customer.
If she's a buyer customer, what's my agency relationship to her? Remember, my agency relationship is to one party. Don't say nothing. That's never the answer. We are a fiduciary state. You're focusing too much on to the buyer part. My agency relationship is to somebody in the transaction. That answer never changes. What's my agency relationship to Tanya, the buyer customer?
Seller, sub-agent.
I'm a seller's agent or seller sub-agent. That's exactly right.
Agent. And I did that on purpose because I was sitting there thinking, I was like, they probably already forgot about it.
I love that you did it. It was perfect. It was the perfect time to interject that because you caught them off guard. You see how easy it is for agency to slip away from you folks. Remember, when you're being asked about the relationship, it's not the relationship just to that person. You're being asked, what is why are you here? What are you here as? What is your function here? Well, my function here is I'm a seller's agent.
Right.
And that doesn't matter whether I'm talking about to Tanya or to the seller. I'm still a seller's agent.
You and Travis, you give an example in previous classes about that. It's like, okay, you have a spouse. I'm going to say I'm married to Justin Timberlake. Anybody else that I talk to, that doesn't change. It doesn't matter if I'm talking to Dudeski over here, a Chicky Doo over here. I'm still married to who I'm married to, which is exactly how you're going to treat your agency relationships. Whoever you are representing, no matter who you're talking to, that agency relationship stays the same. I represent Sally, the seller. If I'm talking to Bob, the buyer, okay, my relationship to you is I'm a seller's agent.
I'm Sally, the seller's agent. That's my relationship to you.
And somebody private messaged me when we just asked that question a couple minutes ago and said honesty and fairness. That's what I owe to them because I have that agency relationship.
And part of honesty and fairness is admitting to Tanya, I'm not your agent. I represent the seller who's not here in front of you right now. Does that make sense for everybody?
I told you I'll solidify agency over the weekend.
Yeah, you got to make sure you get it right. Here's the thing. I'm going to flip this contract advice thing around. We always talk about the buyer side with contract advice. Do we owe seller clients contract advice?
Yes.
Sure. So what does that look like when because if it's a seller client, I'm bringing an offer, that offer's from a buyer. What would I say to the seller when I'm presenting an offer from a buyer to my seller client?
If you think it's good or what you should
do. I think it's a good offer? Do I think the numbers make sense? Do I like the terms? Do I feel like this is a strong buyer? Do I feel like they're going to leave us and not close? Do I feel like, this is the deal they should take? Do I feel like they should accept the offer? Those are all things I'm going to discuss with a seller client. Can I present an offer to a seller customer?
Yes.
What do you think?
Yes.
Of course I can. Of course I can. What does that sound like?
Here's the offer.
Here's
the offer. Do you have questions about what an earnest money deposit is? I'll be glad to explain that to you. Do you have questions about what a purchase price is? I'll be glad to explain it. Can I explain those things to a seller customer?
Give definitions.
Right. But when that seller says, well, do you think this is a fair offer? What am I going to say?
That's up to you, buddy.
What do you think?
Hire me if you want to.
I don't know. I'm not your agent, so I can't really say what I think is good or bad for you. That's really up between you and your agent, which I'm assuming you don't have one. That's why I'm talking to you. But
you got me over here as a partner, but you want wifey material. Like,
right.
Hire me.
And so we do have a responsibility to both clients and customers. Look at this last bullet point. Yes.
If I may, really quick, and then we'll move on. Remember, guys, when we said Corbin is helping a buyer write up an offer on a property, we never said Corbin is helping a buyer client. So if we're not told that he represents that buyer, we represent the seller.
There you go.
Because in North Carolina, you got to represent somebody.
Team A or Team B. We don't have a choice. Right?
Don't forget that.
So now, when you look at this last bullet point that's on the slide right here, it says we as brokers or licensees, whatever you want to call us, we're not an attorney. Which means that our contract advice has to really be limited to what we think is the overall sort of goodness of the contract, not the specific advice of, well, you know what? I don't like what that paragraph says. I don't like that sentence. Can we take that sentence out? Can we delete this paragraph and put this paragraph in? Can you write in a paragraph that says this? Folks, that is beyond the level of advice we are qualified to give as real estate brokers. As a matter of fact, what realm do you think we have ventured into when we start telling people about specific language that should be in a document?
Attorney.
We're practicing as an attorney. And I'm assuming most of you are not attorneys. I'm assuming most of you are not admitted to the bar in the state of North Carolina. And if you're not, now, if you're an attorney, feel free to give that kind of advice. But if you're not an attorney, don't. And so we really have to know that our advice consists of the things that go in the blanks. Is everybody okay with that? That's the way I limit it for myself. My advice about contracts to my clients consists of the stuff that goes in a blank. If there's a blank there, I can give my client advice. It's fair game. Not only can I fill in the blank, I can give them advice about what goes in the blank. Everybody okay with that?
Yes.
But if it's
as far as changing language, though.
But if they want advice about, well, what should I do about this paragraph? I don't know. What do you mean? What should you do about that paragraph? Well, if I don't like it, what should I do? Well, talk to somebody other than me is what you should do, because that ain't for me to tell you. Does that make sense for everybody? That is legal advice at that point in time. Okay? We are not allowed, even if our clients tell us to, that's not obedience we follow, because it'd be violating the law. We do not make adjustments or changes to the pre-printed. Does everybody know what I mean when I say pre-printed language? When you look at a contract form, there's a bunch of crap that's already there. And then there's blanks. What are we allowed to change?
The blanks.
The blanks. We can put stuff in the blanks. We can change stuff that's in the blanks. What are we not allowed to change? The pre-printed crap, right? All that stuff that's already there, got to stay there. And that means don't mark it out. That means don't adjust it. It's not our job. Is everybody okay with that?
Yep.
To do that for clients or customers. Now, we're going to talk about later on how they can do it for themselves. If a client or a customer insists on taking a paragraph out, I can't tell them not to do it, just like I can't tell them to do it. If they do it, can I stop them? Should I even try to stop them?
No,
what do y'all think?
Legal advice.
It's their agreement. I can't give them legal advice.
Right.
Now, I can certainly say to them, there are professionals who will do that for you and have a better idea of what they're doing than you, and those professionals would be called attorneys. But I would only say that if they were my client. I wouldn't even say that to a customer. What would I say to a customer who wanted something changed on a document?
Nothing.
I can't help you with that, period. I can't help you with that. If they want to do it themselves, that's on them. Everybody all right with that? Okay, we're not allowed to do that for clients or customers. Every contract, you know how we, jokingly, like throughout the class, we talk about getting hired, and, we said you're always kind of looking for, for this, right? Well, here's the thing. That's the end of the contract of marriage. That's not the beginning of, even though we think of that as like the beginning of the rest of your life, that's the end of the contract to get married. That contract starts long before you hear that wedding march. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yep.
When does that contract begin? When does that process begin? With a what?
Offer.
An offer. We call it a proposal when it comes to marriage, but ultimately a proposal is nothing more than an offer. Everybody okay with that?
Yep.
Just an offer. Every contract starts with an offer. And here's the thing, don't you be old-fashioned. Some of you got some, you can't be like, don't put everybody in a shoebox over there now, Aunt Berta. Can the young lady propose if she wants to? Right? Can the female propose?
Yep.
Yes.
Of course. Why do I ask you that? It has nothing to do with contracts, except it does. Can a seller be the offeror, folks?
Yeah.
Sure, if they want to. If a seller wants to stand out on the street and every buyer that walks by hand them a pre-printed offer and say, here, all you got to do is sign it and you'll be buying my house. Is there any law that says the seller cannot do that? No, it's not common, but it doesn't mean it cannot happen. No matter whether it's buyer or seller, the offeror will always be which party? Who's always the offeror?
One giving the offer.
The one giving the offer, the one asking the question, the one saying, will you do this? Is everybody okay with that?
Yep.
And the offeree will always be the one who has the power to say one of two very simple but very powerful words. What are the only two answers possible that an offeree can make, folks?
Yes and no.
Yes or no? That is the job of the offeree.
Right.
And I've had people say, that's not true. That's not true, because they could make a counteroffer. They could, but they're no longer an offeree at that point, folks.
Right.
If they make a counteroffer, guess what they become?
Offeror.
Or if she looks at him and she goes, and that expression, you look at her and you're like, she's so happy. No, she's looking at that going, what the shit is that little thing?
Right.
What gumball machine did you get that out of? You better come again with that. We're walking down to Bailey's right now, because that is not a Bailey box under the tree right there. What did she just make?
Counter offer.
A counter offer. She made a counter offer.
She wear the pants.
And it is entirely within. Remember, those roles change. And if she makes that counter offer, she now becomes the what? Offeror, and he becomes the offeree. Everybody kind of understanding that dynamic there? How those roles can shift? During this place, I like to think of this phase as the negotiation phase. This is when all of the terms and conditions are being settled out. Eventually, we get to a point of agreement. Now, in a wedding proposal, we generally hope that's pretty quick. Like, will you marry me? Yes, very fast. Otherwise, it gets awkward. But in other contracts, does it take longer sometimes to iron out the details and go back and forth?
Yes.
Sure. But eventually, if we're going to move forward, we have to come to that moment of saying, you know what? Yep, I'm going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
We call that acceptance. We call it engagement in a marriage proposal, but isn't engagement and acceptance exactly the same thing?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That means when the two parties, the offeror and the offeree, have agreed, let's do the thing. Let's do this thing.
And guys, you see, Travis has some pictures here, and it's for that purpose. You guys should really be just kind of like taking this in and getting a good mental image of what's going on. I wouldn't worry so much about jotting down every single thing he says. Like, just
right. This is more just get your mind in the right process, because again, in my experience, students tend to be too like everything happens all at once. No, this is all a process, right?
Right. I'll start putting stuff in the chat when you start writing stuff down.
And so when this is the acceptance part of the process, which just means everybody's agreed on what the terms and conditions are going to be. Have we finished the contract, or are we just now under contract at this point in time?
Under contract.
We are under contract. We still are waiting for the big event, but eventually, assuming everybody does everything they're supposed to do we close the deal? Eventually, we close the deal. We hope. But listen, just like that marriage, do some of them fall apart before they ever get to that point?
Yep.
Yes. And of course, some of them fall apart after, but that's a whole different subject. But some of them never make it to the finish line. And the same thing is true of contracts. That's why we don't assume that they're closed just because they're what? Just because they're pending or under contract doesn't mean they actually will close. That's why we don't use them as comps and with this morning.
From a test taking perspective, the ones that don't make it to closing, as well as the ones that do make it to closing, those are both types of terminations.
Yes.
One is good, one is bad.
Exactly right. You can terminate this contract in one of two ways. Either they get married or they don't.
They don't.
Either one, the engagement is off. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
The engagement contract is done because you have finished that deal. Either you have decided we ain't getting married and we're completely walking away from each other, or you're going to close the transaction. And even if you close the transaction, you might be married, but you're not engaged anymore. That contract is closed out. Everybody okay with that? Mm-hmm. And so contracts or performance. I put this up one time and somebody said, no, performance is what happens after the wedding. I'm like, come on now.
Like that.
I mean, really?
Lord.
But performance
How many
is...
times do I got to have ALEXA order holy water?
Exactly, right. When you look at contracts, performance is the moment in time when everybody has done what they promised they would do. When we have gotten to the moment. So in a real estate sales transaction, when is performance? When does that happen in a real estate sales contract?
Closing.
Closing. This one's going to be a tougher answer. You ready? Mm-hmm. How about a lease? When do we have full performance of a lease?
When you sign it. Right?
No, we're still under contract when you sign a lease.
When it's over the lease.
When it's over.
Oh, okay.
When it's over. When the tenant moves out. Because only at that point in time have the parties completed their what to each other? Their promises. As long as the tenant is still there, aren't they still promising things to each other?
Yes.
Landlord's promising the property, the tenant's promising money. That promise goes on until it's completely what?
Over.
Over. So every contract has an end point. Agency agreements, we talked about that. What's the best way to end or terminate or an agency agreement? With full what?
Full performance.
We completed the task we were assigned to. It's not the only way we can end that agency agreement. It could be ended because of an expiration date. It could be ended because of mutual agreement, right? But at the end of the day, contracts either perform or they don't. And so performance or closing is the end of the road. It's the goal for every contract. Now is where you can really start to make notes. Because now what we're going to start to do is put legal labels. A lot of vocabulary coming up in the next little while. A lot of vocabulary in this section.
So 8.1 is a very, very basic understanding of contracts. Kind of like with 7.1, we talked about the basic ideas. Now we're doing that same thing, but for contracts.
But for contracts, right? So one of the first things a court of law is going to want to look at about any agreement is whether the agreement is an express agreement or whether the agreement is an implied agreement. Now, I'm not saying one is automatically or necessarily better than the other. That's for you to decide, and it's also situational. But you need to know the difference. An express agreement, and these two pictures both represent express agreements. One of the biggest misconceptions with people about contracts. Because I'll tell you what people want to do. Express equals written, express equals written, express equals written. Well, a written contract is an example of an express contract. But guess what, folks?
Can have express verbal.
A verbal contract is also an example of an express contract. If you have actually taken the time to say in words, whether those words are in writing or verbally, this is the agreement between us. This is what we're going to do for each other. This is what I want you to do for me. This is what you're going to do for, this is what I'm going to do for you. Here's how much compensation is going to be involved. Here's how we're going to do it. If you have actually come up with an agreement with somebody and both parties have agreed to it, that is an express agreement.
Like literally with my aunt this past week, she had asked me to help her with some of her travel agent stuff. We had a verbal agreement. I said, all right, I'll help you. You're going to pay me this much. It was verbal agreement.
There you go.
I'm still yet to be
And
paid,
and that verbal agreement is a what?
express.
It's still an express agreement. Now, there is no doubt that if you end up in court, one of these is probably going to be seen as superior to the other in a court of law. Which one of these express agreements do you think a court of law is probably going to see as being superior?
Written.
A written agreement. That doesn't mean verbal agreements are automatically invalid. Look at what it says about these two types of agreements. It says some oral agreements are enforceable and some are what?
Not.
Some are not. But look at the last statement. What does the last one say?
All written are.
All written are. All written agreements are. So that tells you right away. Which one is better from the standpoint of if you really want to make sure this agreement between these two parties has legal weight. Written express agreement is better than an oral express agreement in that regard. Are we all okay with that statement?
This will come full circle in a second.
Yeah.
It says that some verbal agreements can be upheld in a court. So I don't want anybody to have the idea that, just to get an enforced in court, that it has to be in writing. Like there's some exceptions.
There are some big exceptions, and we'll talk about those. But if you really want to make sure it's enforceable, put it in what?
Writing.
Put it in writing.
Of course, that's the smartest route.
Here, the next one is the most dangerous route. How many of you think that oral sounds like it could be potentially dangerous because you're not sure if it's going to be enforced or not? What do y'all think?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
There's a type of contract, folks, that could very well have legal weight that's even more dangerous than a verbal agreement.
Implied agreement.
The implied agreement. Let me tell you why an implied agreement is the most dangerous type of potential agreement. Because in an implied agreement, it's never clear that the parties are even promising anything to each other. They never actually discuss promises made to each other. But they expect each other to fulfill promises that were never mentioned. I mean, doesn't that, on its face, doesn't that sound kind of crazy? Right? So let me give you an example of an implied agreement. There are dishes in the dishwasher right now. They were there when Drew went to school this morning. If they are there when he comes home this afternoon, my ass is going to get yelled at. We never discussed me emptying the dishwasher. But the fact that they are there created what?
Implied agreement.
An implied agreement between the two of us that I would do what with them?
Wash them.
That I would get rid of them.
See, I have a similar kind of situation with my dishes here at home. Like, if they're still in there when I get off of work tonight, like, somebody except myself is going to get their ass chewed out.
There you go. There you go. Here's the thing. Just like Christine, exactly just like implied agency. It's the same thing. Here's how you know there's an implied agreement. There, reasonably, he should have no expectation the dishwasher will be empty because we didn't what? We didn't discuss it. But is there going to be a penalty if he comes home and it's not cleaned out?
Yes.
You better believe it.
I legit thought that you were going to say there's an implied agreement that he'll just do it once he gets home.
No. Trust me, the whole like working from home changed that dynamic a lot. You work from home now. I can't tell you how many you take that and shove it up your ass. I'm so sick of hearing it, you know. Like, but there's an implied agreement there. Here's the thing. We also have these around us all the time in the real world, but we don't necessarily think of them. When you go to a restaurant, a dine-in restaurant, do you ever really discuss with like the restaurant manager or even the server, like what promises you're making to each other?
No.
I mean, you don't sit there and say, so now, just to be clear, if I order this steak, I'm going to have to pay you $34.99, but you're going to provide me with the steak and you're going to provide me with 2 sides. But if I wanted to get a beverage, I'd have to agree to pay you an additional $3.59. Is that what we're agreeing to? Does anybody actually have that discussion when you sit down in a restaurant?
Yeah, y'all don't.
Well, if you do, you have an express agreement with that restaurant, an express verbal agreement. But most of us just order. And most of the time, the restaurant just accepts our order. And it creates an expectation. We expect that they will prepare the food, correct?
Correct.
And they expect that we will do what?
Pay for it.
Pay for it. That's
Okay,
that's an implied agreement.
This is probably the 5th time that I've heard this, actually more than 5th. But now that I'm hearing it so much, I'm starting to get the idea that I can actually challenge the restaurant because I never said I was going to pay for it.
Well, you could. And here's the interesting thing. You'd probably lose because a judge can still enforce an implied agreement. Because I've heard people say that. So does that mean I can get up and leave the restaurant and not pay? Not necessarily. What it means is it would be up to a judge whether or not you had created what kind of contract, folks?
An implied agreement.
An implied contract. And if the judge believes that, common understanding is that if you order in the restaurant, you have to pay, they could say that's an implied agreement and hold you responsible for that. Does that make sense for everybody? Mm-hmm. And that's why implied agreements are most dangerous. What do you think is better? To have everybody running around with these expectations that they never really talked about, or to actually clearly express the expectations and clearly say, this is what we're going to do for each other and these are what our expectations are?
Clear expectations.
Clear expectations, right?
Somebody sent me this message just now, Travis. It said express equals expression equals explain.
Yes, absolutely. Natalie said, is it an express agreement when the bill's in front of you? No, still not an express agreement. It's still not an express agreement because for it to be an express agreement, both sides have to have agreed to it. When they put a bill in front of you, that's very one-sided, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Right? The agreement was already created when you ordered. See, that's the thing. We so want certainty, but the law doesn't work that way. The law works on if it's clear that the parties were binding themselves to each other, then they have an implied agreement. Whether they actually talked about it or not, they have an implied agreement. That can come as a real surprise for folks.
Right. And I like how Natalie's trying to make connections there, and I know you do too, Travis, but that bill, just for learning purposes, yes, that's what you owe, but you never said I'm going to pay.
So now watch this. I want y'all to hear this. Because I've seen this happen in the real estate world. Because I've heard people say, well, this has never happened in real estate. Oh, yes, it does. Yes, it does. You know how when you reach out on behalf of a buyer client, what's the first thing you need to say to the seller or the seller's agent when you are reaching out to a buyer client? What is the first thing you need to say?
Who you represent?
Represent the seller.
I represent the buyer, right? If you're the buyer's agent, you're reaching out to the seller or the seller's agent. I represent who?
The buyer.
The buyer. Nisha, come back to us. Gratuity is not part of the contract. That's why it's called a gratuity. Okay. When you represent a buyer and you're reaching out to a seller or a seller's agent, first thing you need to say is I represent the buyer. Let me ask y'all a question. Had you better represent the buyer when you make that statement? Had that better be a truthful statement?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. If it's not truthful, guess what you just created?
A felony?
Implied agency. You just implied that you have an agency relationship, do you not?
Absolutely.
And guess what? Guess what? You want good news on that situation? According to the law, you do now have an agency relationship. You are the buyer's agent. Congratulations.
Okay.
And that means you owe the buyer old car for the remainder of that transaction. Isn't that awesome?
That's awesome.
How much are you getting paid for your services? Nothing. Because you never discussed with your client that they were going to actually compensate you. So here's what's interesting. If you didn't do a good job, could the client sue your ass into oblivion for doing a bad job for them?
Yes.
Yes. Because you created the agency agreement by doing what?
Implying
it. Can you make them pay you?
No.
No, because there was never any implication that they would. Do you think you should get involved with implied agreements, folks?
No.
No. Make them clear. Don't operate based on assumption. There you go. Implied agreements means everybody's operating based on the assumption of. Stop it.
That's bad.
Have an express agreement. Either make it verbal or put it in what?
Writing.
Writing. Okay? Right? Either make it verbal or put it in writing. So, here's the thing. Not every agreement needs to be in writing in order to have legal weight.
Right.
Courts of law will sometimes enforce verbal agreements. But who are you leaving it up to when you walk into court with a verbal agreement? Largely, who is it up to?
A third party, a judge.
It's up to the judge to decide if you actually had an agreement and what that agreement actually was, because you don't have anything to point to because it's not in what?
Writing.
It's not in writing. It's going to become he said, she said. How many of y'all watch Judge Judy and watch this thing play out? Now, what's the first thing she always asks for anyway?
If there's any contract?
Where's the
Do you have a written agreement?
Agreement.
And if they do, then we don't have to have this discussion. But if they don't, then you have to listen to testimony from both of them and tell one of them you're lying to me. That ain't the way this is really right. She is always.
I mean, after I watch her show, I'm literally on Indeed applying for judge jobs because I'm over there like with it. I'm like, no, you know damn well she ain't.
That did not happen. Exactly. But that's the danger of a verbal agreement. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Here's my question though. Does that verbal agreement still potentially have weight if Judge Judy believes you?
Yes.
Yes. Because she can force you to do what she believes you promised to do, even verbally. Everybody with me on that?
Absolutely. And remember how we talked about how on one of the footnotes on express verbal agreements where it says some express verbal agreements will be enforced in court. Well, there's also a part of that that's excluding those verbal ones that will not be enforced in court. So some are so important that they need to be put in writing.
That brings us, that is the perfect segue and intro to this law right here. Basically, judges have a lot of latitude in their courts, but they don't have complete and total latitude in their courtrooms. Judges have to follow a law called the Statute of Frauds in North Carolina. The Statute of Frauds says that certain agreements are too important for a judge to wing it and decide that a verbal agreement is enforceable. That certain agreements must be, whether the judge likes it or not, must be what?
In writing.
In writing for the judge to do anything with it.
There's those some episodes where she literally will dismiss them before it even starts. She's like, where's the written agreement? All right, get out of my courtroom.
Well, and that's exactly what would happen here. So watch this. Watch this. If we say a document or an agreement is covered by the statute of frauds, what we're saying is there is no case unless you have it in what?
Writing.
In writing. You could show up in court with video testimony in 8K high definition from 12 different angles.
Yep. Retina identification.
And if it's covered by this law, is the judge even going to look at all of that video footage?
Mm-hmm.
What do y'all think?
She's gonna be like,
no, because they can't. They're not allowed to. They're not given the freedom on certain. Is everybody picking this up? Because this is important right here.
absolutely.
The North Carolina Statute of Frauds says that certain agreements are too important to give judges latitude in deciding whether or not they are enforceable.
Mm-hmm.
If you want certain types of agreements to have legal weight, you must put them into what? Writing. Now, we are not saying that these agreements must be in writing between the two parties. Two parties can do whatever the hell they want to do. It's if they want to sue each other that it becomes important that the agreements are in writing. Because the judge is going to need to see it in what?
In writing.
In writing, if it's on this list. And I've given you 3 examples of things that we've already, there's going to be others as we get through the class, but I've given you 3 examples of things that we've talked about already in this class that are covered by the statute of frauds. 3 very important things to us. Contracts to sell real estate. So let me ask y'all a question, and be careful before you give me a whiplash answer.
Right. I'm gonna turn the chat off while you do that.
Is it illegal for a buyer and a seller to have a verbal contract to sell a piece of land? Is that illegal in the state of North Carolina?
No, it's not.
1.
No. Will that verbal contract to sell that piece of land have any weight in a North Carolina court of law?
No.
No, because it's on this what?
List.
This list. It is covered by the statute. So when we say an agreement is covered by the statute of frauds, what we're saying is a judge will throw your ass out of court unless that agreement is in what?
Writing.
It's in writing. We don't even want to hear what you got to say unless the agreement is in what?
Writing.
In writing. Everybody picking up what I'm putting down there.
Easier and just make everything be in writing.
Well, in some ways that would be easier if everything had to be in writing, but things don't always have to be in writing. I'm going to point out one to you, and we haven't talked about it yet, but guess what? It's never going to make it on this list because they're not required to be in writing.
What?
Leases.
Really?
Leases in the state of North Carolina are not covered by the North Carolina statute of frauds. What does that mean? That a judge, if they want to, I'm not saying they will, but if they want to, what can they do?
Yeah.
They can enforce what kind of a lease? Not throw it out. What can they do if it's not covered by the statute of frauds, folks?
They can enforce a verbal lease.
They can enforce a verbal lease. Because documents that are covered by the statute of frauds only are enforceable if they're in what?
Writing.
Writing. But if they're not covered by the statute of frauds, that means not only are they enforceable when they're in writing, but they might also be enforceable when they're what?
Verbal.
They're verbal. And leases are not covered by the statute of frauds in the state of North Carolina.
We are not here to determine how somebody would prove.
I'm not saying that's a good idea. And I know that's where Steph's headed. That would be stupid. Let me just be clear. That would be dipshit stupid to have a verbal lease
I like that word.
and then take it to court and try to get a judge to enforce it. Because you never know what they might do. Does that make sense for everybody? If you really were planning to enforce it, you should put it in what?
Writing.
But I'm saying, if you got a lease, because I've heard people say this, you sue me all you damn want to. I didn't sign no fucking lease. Well, guess what, baby doll? They may sue you and they may what?
Win.
And they may win because the lease is not covered by the statute of frauds in North Carolina. Now, does it make sense when I say it like that?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Stephen, you had your hand up.
Yeah, my son lives in Asheville. Of course, this is similar because of Asheville. There's so much people moving around in college and everything, and I don't think he's ever signed a lease. And he would say, "Oh, yeah, I've got a lease agreement. It's just oral with for the next 6 months or so." I'm like, "What?" Yeah, I said, "What? No, you didn't. I don't know if that's
Right.
done up here. I don't know." And so I don't know. Sweet it is.
It can be enforced. If the judge really believes that was the agreement, they will enforce it.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying it's smart because it leaves a lot of things open to interpretation for the judge.
I had one for 2 years.
There you go. And it can work just fine. But if you don't want to take the interpretation out, you should always still put it in what? In writing. The statute of frauds is not there to tell you when you should put something in writing. The statute of frauds is there to tell you when you must put certain things in writing. And the ones that show up on this list must be in writing or they will be thrown out of court instantly.
Right. And that's not to say that these things cannot happen without a written agreement. It's just saying if ever something comes worse to worse, you have a verbal sales agreement for a piece of property. If shit hits the fan during that contract, it will not be enforced in court.
That's right.
And still happen.
Seth just gave you gold right there, folks. Can we still have a verbal sales contract on a piece of land? Is that possible?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sure. But if they get mad at each other and somebody wants to sue, what's going to happen with that lawsuit the minute they go in court and tell the judge, well, we know we never put this in writing?
Get kicked out.
Thrown out.
The judge is going to throw it out. Not because they want to, because they what?
They have to.
Didn't have it in
Have to, because that agreement is on this list. Is everybody with that?
That's the whole thing about this entire unit. We're talking about what would be enforced.
Right. Jordan, you had
All
your
these
hand up.
things can happen outside of a written agreement, but what would
Sure.
be enforced? I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, you're fine. Go ahead. Go ahead, Jordan.
Gentlemen, I had a written contract. I bought a portion of land from him, but it wasn't recorded at the courthouse, but it was written. And some of the additional information he wanted to state, which was verbal, was on the contract. But I ended up winning I ended up winning the case because I had the original contract that had all the information that we actually agreed on.
So you went to court and they looked at the written agreement. They said this complies with the statute of frauds and we're going to enforce the written agreement.
They enforced it. Mm-hmm.
There
Even though
you
it
go.
wasn't recorded, they still enforced it. But
Because there is no requirement that it be recorded. There's a requirement that it be in what?
right.
In writing.
Right.
There you go. There you go. So now that we've kind of gotten through that idea, the next slides are going to be all about how can we structure contracts in different ways. But before we look at the differences, let's look at the similarities. I think it's important to remind yourself what's the same in every contract of every type. How many parties are there to a contract? Two. So when we use the phrase third party, do we mean somebody who's in the contract or somebody who's outside of the contract?
Outside.
Right. If you're talking about the marriage thing, the two parties are the two spouses, right?
Right.
The third party could be a mother-in-law. It could be a side piece. It could be the guy conducting the ceremony. It could be the caterer. They're all still what? Third parties.
Party.
Because they're outside the agreement. Every contract has two parties. Everyone. Always. And that means every contract could result in lawsuits going in how many different directions?
Two
different directions. Party number one sues party number two, or party number two sues what?
Party number one.
Party number one. Or sometimes they sue each other. Same time.
Right.
I'm going to sue. No, I'm going to countersue. That's still two directions. Does that make sense for everybody?
Right. And we're not even at a point for asking what would it look like from a test.
No, but
We
I
ain't
just
there
want
yet.
to give you the basics of how a contract works. So what a judge is always trying to figure out when a contract lands in front of them in a court is Did both of these parties make promises? Because it's not necessary that there could be two parties in a contract and only one of them promised to do something. Did both parties make promises or did only one? And can I enforce those promises? Can I force this person to do what they promised to do in this agreement? Are we all in the right mindset before we move forward into the specifics of what's potentially different about these agreements? Everybody okay on the basics of what's the same in every agreement? Okay? Because those are the important basics. Now, if and when a contract is formed between two parties, because every contract does have two parties, the contract needs to be labeled as either a bilateral agreement or a unilateral agreement. A bilateral agreement has two parties. Guess what? So does a unilateral agreement, because every contract has what?
Two parties.
Two parties.
If you get a test question where it says, what's the primary difference between a bilateral contract and a unilateral contract? You know what every single one of you is going to want to answer?
Only one of them has
The number
one
of
party.
parties to the contract.
But you only have one party to a contract. What kind of
What kind of one party to a contract? That ain't a contract.
I ain't keeping no contract with myself. I'm
No.
just saying.
No. Every contract has the same number of parties. Are we all clear on that?
Yes.
The difference between a bilateral contract and a unilateral contract, as Kathleen put in the chat, is how many promises have been made. Here's the way I like to think of it. Put an arrow between them. In a bilateral contract, it's a double-ended arrow because both of them did what?
Make
Agreement.
Both of them promised. In a unilateral contract, it's what?
It's
One
just
person made a promise.
One person making a promise, the other one not promising anything. The other one just saying, you know what? I agree. I like it that you promised to do that. I'm not promising anything in return, but that's great that you're promising that. And I'm going to hold you responsible for that promise. I'll hold you to that promise. But I'm not going to promise you shit in return. That's a unilateral contract. Just thinking about it that way, which one of these is far more common in contract law, folks? Which one do you think is far more common?
Bilateral.
Bilateral.
Addison, you had your...
Unilateral doesn't exist.
Right. Addison, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, can we think of it like this? Like bilateral is two promises, so like a bicycle, and unilateral is one promise, so like a unicycle.
You can, absolutely, as long as you realize that there's always two people on the bicycle and two people on the unicycle because they got the same number of parties, right? Number of wheels might be different, but the number of people riding is the same every time.
You could think of the wheels as the promise.
Okay? I love it.
Addison, do you go by Addie or Addison?
I go by Addie. I'm not sure which one I'm signed up as.
Addie, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool
I don't know
deal.
why she was
Thank you.
scratchy that time. That time she sounded like she sounded like she was like coming on like the Death Star or a destroyer, you know, and the Imperial stormtroopers are coming. I don't know.
I'm nice, I promise.
Now you sound great. See?
Now you sound fine.
You're like you're like you're like Anakin Skywalker. We don't know what side of the Force you're on yet. You know, you go back and forth. So a bilateral agreement is an agreement between two parties that both have made promises to what?
Each
Other.
Each other. You do this for me, and in return, I will do this for you. Now, look at this note up here, because it's a really important thing. If we have a bilateral agreement, how many of those parties that made promises is it going to take to terminate that agreement?
Both sides.
Both. There's no such thing as unilaterally terminating a bilateral agreement. So think about like our agency agreements, a listing agreement. Is that a bilateral contract or a unilateral contract?
Bilateral.
It's a bilateral contract. What does the seller promise to do?
I will pay you.
Allow us to market the property, allow us to do the things it takes to find a buyer, and most importantly, what? Pay us. What do we promise to do for the seller?
Find the perfect buyer.
Market the property, show the property, look for the correct buyer, evaluate the correct buyer, and bring them a buyer, correct?
Correct.
Promises in both directions. That's a bilateral agreement. Sales contract. Good example of a bilateral agreement. A lease. Good example of a bilateral agreement. A promise for a promise. Employment contracts, bilateral agreements. The employee promises to come to work, show up, do the job. What does the employer promise to do? Pay you, right? Among other things, but definitely pay you. That's a bilateral agreement. So these are by far the most common. Doesn't mean they're the only ones that exist, though. The unilateral agreement. Still how many parties? Because I'm going to hammer on that because I know you're going to miss it if I don't.
Two parties.
Still two
You
parties.
hammer it, but they still miss it.
Yeah,
Just
don't
say
miss
in
it.
front of the mirror.
Still two parties. Except only one of them has actually made a promise. Only one of the parties has promised to do something. And therefore, only one party can be held responsible for their promises where?
Court.
In court. Is the other party still part of the contract?
Yes.
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 The other party has still signed the contract. The other party has still agreed to the contract, but they've agreed to make no promises. It's the best kind of contract to be in. I'm going to hold you responsible for your promises, but I'm not going to make any promises to you. That's a great contract if you can get it. Doesn't that sound a little bit wonky though? Right?
Yeah.
Right. It's not very common, not terribly common, but we do it and we just don't think about it. Look at the example I gave down there. You go up to your neighbor and you say, hey, I've been tied up all week. Listen, if you come over here and cut my grass, I'll give you $50. And your neighbor says, okay, I'll think about it. That's a unilateral contract, folks.
Right. Nobody promised they're going to mow the grass.
They did not promise they were going to mow the grass. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
You can't sue them and say, you promised to come mow my grass. And they're going to be like, hell no, I did not promise to mow your grass. You told me you would pay me $50 if I mowed your grass. And I told you I would think about mowing your grass, but I decided I wanted to watch a football game. So I didn't mow your grass. But here's the thing. Does that still have legal weight on the other side, folks? That unilateral agreement. What do you think?
It does.
Yes, it does.
It does. Because if the neighbor cuts the grass,
And they want to.
then guess what? You got to pay them. And they can sue you. And the court will make you pay them because you made a what? You made a promise. Nigel asked if an open listing agreement, a bilateral agreement. Sure it is. Because even in an open listing agreement, the seller's making promises and the listing firm's making promises, right?
Yes,
In an open listing agreement, the seller might not be making a promise of exclusivity, but they are making promises. What's the seller still promising in an open listing agreement?
If you bring the buyer, I'll pay you.
If you bring them a buyer, to allow you to try to find a buyer. What's the firm promising even in an open listing agreement?
Bring a buyer.
Bring you a buyer. That's still a bilateral agreement. It's still bilateral. So it doesn't have as many promises, but still has promises in both directions. Look at that note down there in red, though, because it's the exact opposite of the note about the bilateral contract. And to me, this is the key to understanding a unilateral contract versus a bilateral contract. It says, because unilateral agreements are only binding on one of the two parties, they can be terminated by one. Just the one that's not bound. You don't need what to terminate a unilateral agreement?
A mutual
parties.
You don't need both parties. You don't need a mutual agreement. Does that make sense for everybody? Because only one party is bound. That's why these are rare. That's why these are much rare. So I want you to look at this. It says Carl owns a home in Mebane and has signed a purchase agreement promising to sell the home to buyer Cassie for $350,000. Cassie has promised to close on the home at that price no later than July 15th of 2022. Bilateral or unilateral? What do you think?
Bilateral.
Bilateral.
How many parties?
Two parties.
So two parties. So we got Carl and we got who? Cassie, right?
Yes.
Yep.
And here's a way you can do this. You can draw the arrows. Carl owns a home in Mebane and has signed a purchase agreement. Signed doesn't mean anything. That's not a promise. Signed a purchase agreement promising to sell. Do we have a promise now from Carl?
Yes.
Okay. Carl has promised to sell for $350, correct?
Yes.
Cassie has promised. Do we have an arrow going the other direction?
Yes.
To close on the home at that price no later than July 15th of 2022. Bilateral.
Mhm.
Both of them have promised. Everybody see that? Okay. Look at this one. Brenda has signed a purchase agreement as a buyer of a piece of vacant property. So we got Brenda on one side in Orange County. The seller has agreed to sell the land to Brenda. We don't have a name for the seller, so we'll just write seller. Seller has agreed to sell the land to Brenda for $1,450,000 with a scheduled closing date of August 10th, 2022. Okay? Talk to me about promises you have seen so far and read very carefully. Brenda has signed. That is not a promise. Signing is not a promise.
It's only one so
Okay.
far.
It says Brenda has signed a purchase agreement as a buyer of a piece of property in Orange County. The seller has agreed to sell the land to Brenda for $1,450,000. Do we have a promise now?
Yes.
Yes.
From the
Which
seller.
direction?
From the seller.
The seller to Brenda.
Seller. The seller has agreed to sell for $1,450,000. Everybody see that that's a promise
Yes.
with a scheduled closing date of August 10th, 2022. Brenda has 30 days remaining in an option period that allows her to change her mind and terminate the agreement. Has she actually promised to buy this property for $1,450,000, folks?
No. Yeah.
No, not yet. At some point, she'll pass a deadline where she has promised. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yep.
But she has not promised right now. What kind of contract do we have here?
Unilateral.
This is an example of a unilateral contract.
How many parties made a promise?
One.
One.
Good job.
And how many
Two
parties are
parties
in the
total.
transaction?
Two.
Two. There you go. How many parties does it take to terminate this one?
One.
Just one. Either one or a specific one?
So do you?
Specific one.
A specific one. Who can terminate this thing?
Not
Seller.
not bound.
Not the seller. No. The seller made a promise.
Oh, okay.
Not bound.
Brenda has 30 days.
Brenda is the one that didn't make a promise. Who can terminate? Brenda.
Brenda.
Is the seller locked into this contract?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
That's because he
They
made a
promised.
Would Brenda be locked in the contract if she waited after the 30 days?
That's the way it's worded to me. After 30 days, she no longer has the right to do what?
Cancel.
Cancel. So she will now, after 30 days, what will we draw in? An arrow from Brenda to the seller. She is now what? She's now promised, and the contract would change at that point from what?
You need to buy.
Lateral to bilateral. Look at Caitlin. She says like a free trial. There you go. During the free trial period, it's what kind of a contract?
Unilateral.
Unilateral. You go past that free trial, it becomes what? Bilateral. Everybody okay with that?
And even without the agreement, even though she's not made an agreement, it's still going to be bilateral.
Here's the thing. She has made an agreement, Jordan. She agreed up front that her right to walk away would last how long?
30 days.
30 days. There's an agreement. Clock's ticking.
It's an agreement, not a promise.
All right.
That's like
It's an agreement that in 30 days is going to become a what?
a promise.
A promise. What she's essentially agreeing to is that in 30 days, I promise I will what? Purchase your property at this price. Therefore, if I'm not going to purchase it, I need to let you know when.
Before 30 days.
Before 30 days. Okay. So somebody sent a private message that said signing a purchase agreement isn't a promise. Not always. Right. Not unless the agreement you signed actually says you what?
Will do something.
You will do something.
It's like the grass. Like your neighbor says, I'll pay you $50 if you cut my grass. But that's all it says, and both of y'all sign.
And here's the thing: if you both of you sign it, the one who's promised to pay has clearly promised. Has the other one promised to cut the grass?
No.
No. They just signed saying, I understand you promised.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you need to, and this is new for most of you, you need to understand that just signing an agreement does not mean you've actually promised to do anything in that agreement. It's just an acknowledgement that you've read it and you understand it. Does that make sense for everybody?
Right.
Now, if you've read it, you understand it, and there are promises in it and you sign it, are you now bound to those promises? What do you think?
Yes.
Yes. But if you've read it, you understand it, you sign it, and there's no promises there, you haven't promised anything. Everybody okay with that?
Yes.
Right? Not signing something doesn't necessarily mean you've promised. It just means you've acknowledged it. That's all. Now, as we've already started discussing, really the only thing that matters from our perspective about contracts is not what the agreement says, whether it says it verbally or says it in writing. All of that's unimportant to us. What's really important to us is what would happen to it if it ended in court. If there was a dispute between these two parties, if they were at each other's throats, if they could not figure out how to handle this thing on their own, where are they most likely going to end up at that point in time?
In court.
In court. And when and if they end up in court, what does become our concern is, would the courts enforce this agreement? Ideally, would the courts enforce this agreement on both parties if both of them have made promises? Because we already decided that most of these contracts are going to be what kind of contracts? Bilateral. So most of the time when a contract ends up in court, you're going to be there because it was a bilateral contract in the first place. And that's the only place to settle a contract dispute. When we end up in court, the judge has to decide, first of all, does this agreement meet some very basic rules? What do you think the first thing the judge is going to look at? We already talked about it. What's the first law the judge has to look at before they decide anything else about this agreement?
Statute of frauds.
Statute of frauds. So what are we trying to decide when we look at the statute of frauds? What's the judge trying to figure out?
It's in writing.
Does this need to be? Does it
Does
need
it
to be in
need
writing?
to be in writing? Not is it in writing yet, but does it need to be in writing? Based on so the judge has to look at what the promises are and figure out what type of agreement it is. Because if this is a lease, do they care about the statute of frauds, or are they just going to move right on to figuring out what's in the agreement?
They're going to
Move right on.
Move right on to figuring out what's in the agreement. But if it's a sales contract, what's the first thing they want to know?
Is it in writing?
Is it in writing? Because they have to do that. Is everybody good with that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, second consideration. Did the parties voluntarily agree to the terms and conditions of this agreement? The parties, before a judge will enforce the agreement, the judge has to believe that the parties were in perfect agreement when they went under contract. Now, this does not, if something's not covered by the statute of frauds, if something is verbal, obviously we're not going to have these. But on written agreements, what's the best possible evidence that both parties agreed perfectly to the same terms?
Their signatures.
Not how many sets of signatures?
Two.
Two. On separate documents or on the exact same document?
Same one.
Same document.
Same one. With no changes made between when one side and when the other side. Because here's the thing. If somebody looks at an agreement and says, well, yeah, my signature's on there, but it was not like that when I signed it, is that going to be a problem?
Yeah.
Yes. Right? But so what a judge is looking at is to determine, did both parties agree to these terms exactly as they're written? The best proof of that is signatures from both of them. That's when signatures become really important. As long as the judge agrees that there is identical agreement by both parties, they're going to ask themselves a simple question and ask the parties a simple question. Did you sign this? Did you agree to this voluntarily? Or what's the alternative to doing it voluntarily? Were you what?
Forced.
Were you forced in any way? Were you in any way forced to sign this agreement? That is a very bad thing, folks. When someone is forced in any way into an agreement, that is going to be a problem for a judge. Does that make sense that it's probably not going to be an enforceable agreement if we figure out that somebody did not voluntarily agree to it?
Right.
Right? So that's one of the first things the judge has to figure out. There are a couple of examples of things that would represent non-voluntary agreement. First of all, the agreement's wrong. There were mistakes made. That probably means the parties didn't really agree to what they think they agreed to. Fraud or misrepresentation. That probably means the parties did not agree to what they thought they agreed to. But then look at these two others. I think you might see, not definitely will, but might see a test question that wants you to differentiate between two types of not being a volunteer, two types of being forced or coerced into signing. One has to do with physical threat, violence, starvation, not going to give you your medicine, not going to let you get out, not going to let you get any water, not going to let you out of this room, threats to sign a contract. What do y'all think that one's called? What is it called when somebody's under the threat of physical harm when they sign?
Duress.
Duress. That's duress. Okay. The second one is the threat of some type of emotional damage, not physical damage, but emotional damage, which usually means the person threatening has to have some type of a personal relationship with the person that was coerced. That's called undue influence. Like as an example, I'm an only child. Do you think it is possible that I could exert undue influence over my mother? In other words, is our relationship close enough that if I really pressed her and I threatened her with like maybe never talking to her again, that I could probably force her to sign pretty much any agreement she wants, I would want her to sign?
Yeah. Totally.
Is she under duress or is she under undue influence? Have I threatened her physically or have I threatened her emotionally, spiritually?
It's undue influence.
Undue influence.
Good. It's undue influence. It's undue influence. How about if I say to mom, well, you know what, Mom? I'm the one who picks up your medicine every month. If you don't sign this contract, I'm just going to stop bringing it up there.
Duress.
Yeah, you're under duress.
Yeah, she's under duress now. That's the threat of physical harm. Does everybody see the difference?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. That is under duress. When you're under duress, physical harm. The second major, I'm sorry, Cheryl, go ahead.
So to use that example, duress, undue influence would mean if you say to your mom, listen, like, if you're not nice to me, I'm not going to pick up your medication anymore. Or no, that would still be under duress.
That's under duress. That's physical harm.
Yep.
Undue influence is, Mom, I think you should sign this thing. Well, let me put it this way. If you don't sign this thing, I'm never talking to you again. That's undue influence. I'm not harming her physically. I'm harming her what?
Emotionally.
Honey, we're selling this house. We're either going to sell it as a married couple or we're going to sell it as a divorce. Your choice. Either you sign this agreement, we sign it, and we sell the damn thing, or I'm filing for divorce tomorrow. Duress or undue influence?
Undue influence.
Undue influence. Does everybody see the difference now?
Yes.
Damien was held at knife point and forced to sell his property.
Duress.
That's the difference. Physical threat versus emotional threat.
Thank you.
Another required thing that a judge will look for, and remember, they only look as far as they need to. If they find that somebody's under undue influence or duress, they stop looking, because that's not going to be what kind of an agreement?
A mutual agreement.
It's not going to be enforceable, right? At that point in time. And so they keep working their way down the line. The next thing a judge is going to look at is, does the contract that they're being asked to enforce include the most important promise of all? Now, there are a lot of important promises that might be made in a contract, and courts say that they're all important. But there's one promise that the courts say is far more important than all others in a contract. In fact, courts say that one promise is so important that if it's not in the contract, you don't have a contract. You don't have an enforceable agreement. Anybody guess what that one promise? Not that we're cynical, or anything in this country. What do you think the one promise is that's got to be there? Money, baby. Money. Something of value. If the courts cannot look at that agreement and determine what the heck it is that you were supposed to be paying or exchanging they're going to throw the agreement out and say it's not enforceable. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
So if it's a lease, what should clearly be specified in the lease?
The
Rent.
Money.
Out of the rent,
Mhm.
right? If it's a sales contract, what should clearly be specified in there?
Sales price.
The sales price. Let me ask you this. How many of you would like a house in Cary?
me.
You want one, Christina?
That's my next one.
I tell you what, write this up for me while you're doing notes over there. I want you to write up something that says, I, Travis Everette, will gift Christina Brito 114 Heidinger Drive in Cary, North Carolina. I want you to write that up. And if you write it up, I'll be glad to sign it. We'll sign it right here in front of this whole class. You write it up and I'll sign it.
I'm
You can have it. You can have it, free of charge. 114 Heidinger Drive. You want it? Go ahead and write it up.
Okay.
Go for it. I'll sign it. What do you think's going to happen, folks, when she gets to court with that thing?
It's not going to be enforceable.
Nothing.
What do you think the judge is going to say about that agreement that she's so proud of?
There's no money involved.
You ain't got no money. You ain't got no money involved. What are they going to do with the agreement?
Toss it out.
Toss it out. Toss it out. Because this is one of the guaranteed requirements of forming a binding contract in the state of North Carolina. Not that we're cynical or anything. It's got to have money. So, you ever had anybody oh no, I insist. Let me pay you $1.
Yeah.
Why?
Makes it enforceable.
It makes it enforceable. If you give it to them, it's not enforceable. But if they pay you $1 for it, it is what? It's enforceable. That's what consideration is. There has to be some promise of the exchange of something of value for there to be consideration. Everybody okay with that? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Got to be some money involved. Or something of value in North Carolina. In South Carolina, they're much kinder than we are. Actually, South Carolina statutes say that love and emotional connection can be considered consideration. You can actually write that in a contract in South Carolina. Isn't that cute? You can actually write in a contract in South Carolina, in consideration of your love and affection, I will transfer this property to you, and that will be enforceable in the state of South Carolina. And North Carolina, like, no, honey, you got to have some money. No, that ain't gonna work. We don't care what your love and affection's worth here. Just a little fun difference in state laws. The next thing, assuming there is consideration in the contract, and we keep working our way through it, the next thing the judge is going to look at, how many of you all of a sudden are like, there's a lot more involved when we end up in a lawsuit than I thought these judges were actually doing, right?
Oh, yeah.
The next thing the judge has to do before they can actually figure out if they're going to enforce the agreement or not, they have to still figure out if it's enforceable. And the next thing on their list is to determine if the parties to the contract are mentally competent, or more importantly, were mentally competent at the moment they agreed to be under contract. Were these two parties in their full sensibilities? Now, we can all debate about, some people, I'm not sure how much mental competence they have at all times, but that's a different subject. The law basically says, unless the court has declared you to be mentally incompetent, you are mentally competent. As long as you have reached a certain milestone. What's the one big milestone you got to get over to have mental competency in North Carolina?
18 years old.
You have to reach the age of 18. That's exactly right. In the state of North Carolina, a contract with a minor is not an enforceable contract against the minor. The idea here is that the minor does not know what they agreed to. They could not understand the promises that they made. Everybody good with me on that? Okay. A contract with somebody who was intoxicated at the time they accepted the agreement cannot be enforced on that person. So now, don't ask me how you prove that. That's up between you and the judge to figure that part out. What I'm telling you is simply the rules the judge will apply. They will try to figure out were the party. So what do they largely ask a lot of times? And the parties don't even realize why they're being asked these questions, by the way. When an agreement gets presented to a judge, what do you think one of the first things they ask them is? Were you what?
Sober?
Drinking.
Were you drinking? Were you taking any illicit drugs? Were you sober when you signed this? They're trying to check this box off that the parties were what?
Mentally impaired.
Mentally competent. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
Now, once they've determined they're mentally competent, we move on past this. If they determine that they're not mentally competent or were not mentally competent at that time, then we can't enforce the agreement against that person. But I will point this out. Mental competency can change. I call it temporary insanity. Being drunk makes you temporarily insane. Now, I've had family members who were permanently insane because they never were sober, but that's a whole different discussion, right? But being intoxicated means you are temporarily not with your wits about you. It is possible that the judge will say, because this has happened, we've been under contract for 6 weeks, and somebody gets sued, and they go in and they go, Your Honor, I was drinking that night when I signed that contract. What do you think the next question the judge is going to ask is?
You've been drunk ever since.
Have you been drunk the whole time since? At some point, you should have sobered up and realized you're what? Signed something. And at that moment, you should have spoken up and said what? I want out. I was drunk when I agreed to this. Is everybody okay with that?
Yeah. Yep.
You can't use the fact that you didn't know what you were doing at that moment as an excuse if you haven't tried to fix it since then. Now, if you send an email that morning like, listen, I was completely drunk. I'm so sorry. I did not know what I was signing. And then later on down the road, they're still trying to hold you responsible. That's when you point out, listen, I was drunk, and I pointed that out to them the very next day. What do you think the judge is probably going to do?
Throw it out.
Throw it out. We can't hold you responsible for that. Okay. Now, that is very different than somebody who's been permanently declared mentally incompetent, which can also happen in a court of law. When people have been declared permanently incompetent, they cannot fix that. When somebody's not going to regain competency, that's very different. That gets thrown out instantly. We're not even going to try to determine, well, did you sober up or did you turn 18 or did any of those things happen? Because that's somebody who permanently doesn't have the ability. We still aren't done. There's one more question the judge has to ask themselves before they can decide if they're going to enforce this agreement. And it's maybe the most important question of all for the judge. Because remember, what does enforce mean? What is a judge forcing when they enforce an agreement?
A promise.
The promise. They're forcing the promises. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
What if the promises themselves are rotten? What if the promises themselves it's like a hit that you signed to take out on your mother-in-law because you can't stand her? Do you think a judge, even if this agreement meets all these other conditions, do you think a judge is going to enforce that agreement and say to the hitman, now you got to kill her. You promised right here you would kill her and he would pay you and this is bilateral and you both knew what you were doing. Do you think the judge is going to enforce that or are they going to get rid of it?
Yeah.
Get rid of it.
Get rid of.
They're going to get rid of it. That's called a void contract. That's the only time we use the word void in this class, and we'll talk more about that. But the only time we use the word void is when the contract itself is rotten. It's not a problem, because all the other problems we talked about were with the people. You know, was somebody drunk? Was somebody out of their mind? Did somebody forget to promise to pay money? But when you look at the contract and you're like, this contract, the whole thing is just rotten. What do we say that agreement is?
A void.
It's a void agreement. And that's going to get thrown out. That's going to
the
get
least of your problems.
What's that, Stephen?
I said that's the least of your problems.
Well, right. If you go in there with a hit, I'm guessing after they dismiss your case, they might point you over to the district attorney and say they'd like to have a word with you for a minute.
Yeah.
FYI. Like, to see the folks over there with the handcuffs, they'd like to talk to you. And Stephanie said this actually happened in Utah. A landlord put sexual actions on the lease agreement. Wow. And now is in big.
How stupid can you be?
Yeah, that's not good.
Wow.
That's not good.
Maybe he thought it was one of his wives.
Well, maybe, but apparently it was an illegal sexual. Not only were they sexual actions, but illegal ones. So they were out there. They were out there. So now, once courts have decided that we meet all these agreements or meet all these criteria, then we finally are able to label a contract. Before the judge will act on the contract, they have to put a label on the agreement. And that's what these next slides are about, and they will be tested. What these next slides will be tested for sure. What are the labels that we put on these contracts based on their level of enforceability? Basically, we're going to have contracts that are fully enforceable, contracts that are partially enforceable, and contracts that are not enforceable at all. And we need a label for each one of those. Which one do you think we're going to start with?
Enforceable.
Fully enforceable. Fully enforceable. That is called a valid contract. And you've probably heard that terminology before. You may even have used that terminology before. But a fully enforceable agreement is an agreement called a valid agreement. Here's all that means, folks. A valid agreement simply means that it's a bilateral contract where both parties are bound. There is no getting out of this. You both made what? Promises. You both understood those promises. You both were of age. You both were sober. You both promised to exchange things of value. And yeah, if you don't have your camera on, please help Seth out. You both promised to exchange things of value with each other, so there was consideration. It meets all the requirements. So rather than say the contract is fully enforceable, what would a court use? It means the same thing as fully enforceable. What would a court use? What would the label be? Valid. This agreement is valid. So that would actually be the first thing the judge would say before they announce their ruling. I've reviewed the agreement. I've reviewed the circumstances. I find this agreement to be what? Valid. What does that mean? What are they about to do? Who are they about to enforce that agreement on?
Both parties.
Both parties. We're going to make both of you do what you promised to do. All both of you got to do what you promised to do. How do we feel about that statement? Right? That's a valid agreement. Now, here's what I want you to understand. These statuses are fluid. Just because an agreement was valid 1 minute doesn't mean it's valid the next. It also doesn't mean if it was somehow not valid that can't be fixed. Most contracts start as valid contracts. Because if you think about it, most contracts are going to be between two adults. So we've satisfied that requirement, right? Most contracts are going to have consideration. Most contracts are going to be in writing. So even if it's required to be in writing under statute of frauds, we probably satisfied that agreement. Most contracts we can show mutual agreement because how many people signed them? Two parties, right? Most contracts don't have illegal promises in them. So right away, most contracts start as what status? What's the most common status?
Valid.
Valid. Most agreements are valid. But it only stays that way so long as both parties are honoring their agreements. If a promise is broken, folks, if a promise is broken, we no longer valid. Now, we're not going to say what we are yet. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But I want you to understand that breaking a promise on a valid contract means you no longer have a what? A valid contract. Here's why that is. The person who just broke their promise can't hold the other person responsible anymore. The judge is not going to say this is a valid agreement because that means they could possibly force both parties to act. No judge is going to force someone to act who didn't break a promise when the other one did break a promise. Who might they force? The one who broke the promise. Does that make sense for everybody? But no judge is going to look at somebody and say, you didn't follow your promise after the other person didn't follow theirs first. That's not fair. So if a promise gets broken, the contract is not valid. It's no longer what? Fully what?
Fully enforceable.
Fully enforceable. Everybody with me okay?
Yeah.
Now it might be partially enforceable or partly enforceable. Well, there's only two parties. If fully enforceable means enforceable on both, what do you think partially enforceable means?
Only enforceable on one side.
Enforceable on
One side.
one side. one side of the agreement. That is called a voidable contract, folks. A voidable contract. Not void, not valid, but what?
Voidable.
Voidable. Voidable. Here's the way I like to think of voidable. Think of it as two words. One party is void and the other is what? Able. That'll solve it right there for you. One ready to go, doing what they're supposed to do. The other one, asshole. That's a voidable contract. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
Now, there's a variety of reasons you can be the side that's not ready to go. There is a complete variety of reasons you could be the side that's not ready to go. Voidable doesn't necessarily mean you did bad things. It just means one side or the other is not going to be held responsible. And so again, the judge, before they give a verdict, they would say, I've reviewed the agreement and I find this to be a what?
Voidable.
A voidable contract. I find that only the seller is bound or only the buyer is bound. The other party, for whatever reason, is no longer bound to this agreement. Is everybody with me on that?
Yeah.
Okay. That means the one that's not bound has the right to do what?
Get over it.
Get out of the contract.
Get out of it with no penalty. The judge will not hold them responsible because they're not legally bound. So I like to think of these as being one step down from valid. If valid is fully enforceable, both parties have to do what they promised. Voidable is one step down the ladder. Enforceable on what?
One side.
One side. There's a reason I have this picture here on the screen. Other than the fact that this is Seth's kindergarten graduation picture, which I think is cool that we were able to incorporate that into the class. It is your picture. You know,
Is it really? He's lying.
No.
it is.
I was about to say he's lying.
It's him. I mean, doesn't it look like
It doesn't
him?
look
It
far off
looks
though.
a little like him, but
I have brighter
I was like,
hair.
yeah, I was about to say his hair is brighter.
His
Unless
hair-
he dyed it.
His
Well,
hair is
now
brighter.
it's-
Once he found the peroxide, right,
There you go.
in his life. So a voidable agreement is one where only one party has the right to get out. In that agreement that you see the picture of, which party do you think has the right to get out of the agreement?
The kid.
Little
The
kid.
child.
Baby Seth.
Here's what's interesting. Yeah, baby Seth can get out. Here's what's interesting. The adult, and this is where it's going to conflict with your brain, because here's what your brain's telling you. This contract is garbage. This contract is trash. Is this contract trash, folks?
Not yet.
No. Who is still bound to do what they promised to do? Who can be held responsible?
The
The
adult.
adult.
The adult.
The bill.
Can baby Seth hold the adult responsible here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can baby Seth sue the adult and win?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Wait, he turns 18?
Even before he turns
Because he's
18,
underage.
because there's no requirement to be an adult to file a lawsuit, folks.
That's true.
The child can hold the adult responsible.
We're like baby Justin Bieber.
But this is not just in cases of minors. All those things that we talked about. How about a contract with an intoxicated person? What status do you think that would have? If one of them was sober when they signed, the other one was intoxicated, what status do you think the judge would label it?
It'd be voidable.
It'd be voidable. Who would be bound to the contract?
The one
The
that was
person that wasn't drunk.
The one that was sober. Who would be able to get out?
the intoxicated.
The one that was intoxicated. Don't think of that as a contract that's not going to happen. Because here's the thing. The one who was sober may be the one that wants out. The one who was sober may be like, I don't know what I was thinking either. You were drunk. I was just being stupid. Let's just cancel the deal. But what if the person who was drunk has now sobered up and is like, apparently I make the best damn deals when I'm drunk. I like this damn thing. Can they force the deal? Can the drunk person force the deal?
Yes.
They sure can. Because the one who was sober is still bound. Does that make sense for everybody?
Like he knew exactly what he was doing.
Because they knew what they were doing. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So voidable does not mean gone. It just means only one side is still tied to the thing. And so I've given you a couple of examples here. The minor is one. It says a minor signs an agreement, but later becomes an adult and doesn't try to get out of the agreement. So let's say baby Seth signs this thing. 15 years later, they come back and baby Seth wants out. And now he's 24. What's the court going to say?
No, you can't.
You can't get out now.
Yeah.
You can't get out now. Now you're an adult and you've been an adult for a while. You understand what you agreed to. Is everybody okay with that?
Mm-hmm.
So it started as voidable, but now it's become what?
Valid.
Valid. Great. Awesome. When you see that can change gears. How about this one? The example I give you, it says, a seller who promised to replace the roof breaches their sales agreement by refusing the roof. So they've gone under contract, they promised to replace the roof, and now midway through, before they close, they say, you know what, I've changed my mind, I'm not fixing the roof. What's the status of the contract when they breach it?
It's enforceable, isn't it?
Voidable.
Voidable. What did it start as when they first agreed? What did it start as?
It started as valid.
Valid. And then the seller breached it. What did it become at that point? Voidable. Who could enforce it at that moment?
The judge, court.
Yeah, I know the judge, but on behalf of who? What side still has power?
Buyer.
The buyer does. The buyer could sue and win. They promised, Your Honor, right? Who has no power the minute they breach?
Seller.
The seller. Everybody okay with that? Could the seller regain their power?
Yes.
Yes.
By doing what?
Repairing the roof.
Get back in line. Because if they end up in court and the buyer goes, well, they promised to replace the roof and they didn't do it and I want out, what's the seller going to naturally say?
I'll do it.
Excuse me, I already did it.
Right.
Yeah, I said no to you, but then the next week I thought better of it and I did it. Damn roof's on the house. Guess what the judge is likely to say about that contract? We have a what agreement now?
We have a valid.
We got a valid agreement.
Valid agreement. We're back to a valid agreement. Everybody's in line. There's no reason for this not to be valid. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now Tracy said, is there a time frame after the fact? No, Tracy, that's up to who? Who's all that latitude up to?
Judge.
The judge.
Judge.
That's when people say, well, how long do you have to sober up after? That's up to who?
Judge.
The judge. What you need to understand is it can change. What we're talking about is what was the status in that moment. And voidable means in that moment it was only enforceable on how many? In that moment it was only enforceable on how many if it's voidable?
One.
Good. We could take another step down the ladder. We ain't at the bottom yet. I should do this in the reverse order. That way I could play. We started at the bottom, now we're here. I just thought of that. We should reverse the order. We should start at this one. We came from the top down, though. I don't know what song suits that. When we look at the last step on the ladder, where there is no weight in either direction, that is called a what kind of agreement?
Unenforceable.
An unenforceable agreement. It's bilateral because how many of them made promises? They both made promises. But how many of those promises would get upheld in a court of law?
None of them.
Neither.
None. Because the judge has found problems not just on one side, but on what?
Both sides.
Both sides. The judge has found problems on both sides. And so therefore they have to look at the contract and say, I'm sorry. I know you think you've agreed to these things, but at the end of the day, this is an unenforceable agreement. And there could be a variety of reasons. In fact, it could have even started as a valid agreement. How many of you think it could start as valid and make its way to unenforceable?
Yes.
Well, think about that. The situation with the seller who didn't repair the roof. They started as what? Buyer and seller agreed to a contract. They agreed the seller will replace the roof. What do we start as?
Valid.
Valid. Seller says, I'm not fixing the roof. Immediately we become what?
Voidable.
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 Voidable, because one side is screwed up. Everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
The buyer says, well, if you ain't replacing the roof, I sure as shit ain't paying you this money that I'm supposed to pay you.
Yep.
What kind of contract do we have now?
Unenforceable.
Unenforceable. Because how many of them are now in breach?
Both.
Both. Two screw ups. Could that be fixed back to valid?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, if everybody gets back in line, guess what the status of the contract becomes again?
Valid.
Valid.
Valid. Right? There's no reason that we have to stay unenforceable. There's no reason we have to, we don't. Just do what they said they were going to do. Exactly, Salma. However, unenforceable does have a pretty special meaning in some way. It can still be fixed, but you got to fix how many sides to get back from unenforceable back to valid?
Both sides.
Both sides. One great example of an unenforceable agreement, remember the statute of frauds, kind of bring it back full circle to that law? It said certain agreements were so important that if you wanted them to be enforceable, they have to be in what?
Writing.
In writing. Folks, if you show up in a court of law and you claim to have a sales agreement for land and you don't have it in writing, how many sides screwed that up?
Both sides.
Both sides, correct?
Yeah.
Yep.
Correct.
What is a judge going to declare that agreement as being if it's covered by the statute of frauds, but it's not in writing?
Enforceable.
It's unenforceable because you didn't put it what?
Right.
Writing, and the statute of frauds says you have to. I'm sorry, I can't do anything with this agreement. I don't care that you got video proof. I don't care that you got an audio recording. You both screwed up by not putting it in writing, so your agreement is what?
Unenforceable.
Unenforceable.
Enforceable.
Could that be fixed, though? Could we go right back to valid if we wanted to, or to valid where we've never been there?
Yes.
Yes.
How do you fix that problem?
Put it in writing.
Put it in writing. If the two parties still want to agree to it and they still want to put it in writing, all of a sudden, wham, bam, we're no longer unenforceable. We are now what?
Valid.
Valid.
Simple as that. So I don't want you to think of unenforceable as necessarily bad. It's not great, but it can still be fixed. Everybody with me?
Yes.
There is one contract status. And I'm telling you, be careful of this on the test because it really means something very different. There is one contract status that cannot be fixed. There is no departing this status. This status is dead. Never was a contract, never will be a contract. There's nothing you can do about this contract to make it into a contract because the problem is not with the people. The problem is not with the parties. No person screwed up here. What is screwed up about a void agreement?
The contract.
Agreement. The contract.
Agreement is screwed up. Here's what it looks like for a judge to look at a void agreement. Two perfectly normal looking people show up in court and they're suing each other. And the judge says, okay, do you have a written agreement? And they say, yes, Your Honor, we do. And they give the judge the written agreement and the judge takes a few minutes to look over the agreement. And the look on the judge's face as they read the agreement is, what the fuck am I looking at here? No. No. This is a no. That's the end of the case. What are they going to declare that agreement? Void. Because the problem, do they need to ask if somebody was sober when they signed it?
No.
It doesn't matter. Because whatever they've promised to do is so egregiously bad, it can't happen. Does that make sense for everybody?
Right.
Here's where you have to be careful. Folks, there's nothing illegal about a minor signing a purchase agreement. That's not a void agreement. There's nothing wrong with the promise. There's nothing wrong with the agreement. The problem is with the person. That's not void. That's what?
Voidable.
Voidable. Don't mess that up. Folks, you have to envision that judge sitting there reading that thing. Before you say void, what's the problem with the agreement? Not the people you're looking at, but the what?
The
The agreement itself. You look at the agreement and you literally drop it on your desk and go, I cannot believe what the hell I just read. I just don't even know what to say, y'all. I can't even believe what I just read. Sort of like with the point earlier about the person in Utah having like sexual favors written into a lease. I'm sure that went really well in court up until the judge read the lease. What do y'all think?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the judge is talking to both of them. They both seem normal. They both seem intelligent. They both seem like well-adjusted. They both seem sane. They're both adults. Don't see any problems here. Looks like we're going to have a valid agreement today. And then they read the agreement. And the shit hits the fan. Because the problem was never with the people. It was with the what?
Contract.
It was with the contract, the agreement itself. That's a void agreement. Is that clicking into place for everybody? Because that really does need to settle in about what's void. Matter of fact, I would say, Seth, this is probably cheating on the test, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think you can safely eliminate void as an answer choice on the test.
Absolutely.
Because think about it. It would have to be such an outrageous example for void to be the answer. I mean, are they really going to give you the test question that says, what would be the status of a contract if the landlord required the tenant to come over and perform fellatio on them twice a week? Well, I mean, are they really going to ask you that on a real estate exam?
Probably not.
Probably not. So when you get one of these test questions, and you will, about what is the status of this contract, what one can you pretty safely eliminate as being the answer? Void. It's probably not going to be a void contract. It might be voidable. It might be unenforceable. But that's very different than void. Everybody okay with that? With me on that? Mm-hmm. Void is just a really out there, extreme sort of circumstance. So those are the labels that a judge would put on a contract. Last thing we need to talk about here with the contract basics, because I told you it's going to be so vocabulary heavy here. Last thing we need to talk about with the contract basics is this. Is the contract an executory contract, or is the contract an executed contract? Mm-hmm. That has nothing to do with the status as far as enforceability. This has everything to do with timing. If you show up in court with an executory contract, you're showing up while you're still pending. You're showing up while you're still under contract. Does that make sense for everybody? Mm-hmm. So have executory contracts been signed?
Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm. That's what made them executory. Have they been performed? Have they been completed? Have they been closed?
No.
So a buyer and a seller who are under contract and they're suing each other, do they have an executory agreement or do they have an executed agreement?
Executory.
They have an executory agreement. A landlord and a tenant, where the tenant moved in 6 months ago, do they have an executory agreement or an executed agreement?
Executory.
Executory, because the tenant's still what?
Still in
the property.
Still there. When does it become, folks, an executed agreement?
When they leave.
For a lease, when they leave. For a sales contract, when it what?
When it closes.
When it closes. For an agency agreement, when the relationship ends, right? Executory means we still have an agreement and we're trying to figure it out. Executed means what?
It's finished.
It's completed.
Closed. And if you really want to think about the very morbid example, somebody who is executed, that's over, right? And if they're sentenced to death, they are executory, right? They're sentenced to death, they become executory. It's coming, but it ain't here yet, right? Somebody throws the switch, that's executed, right? That is over.
Executor sits on death row.
Right. And when they're on death row, they're executory. There you go. Exactly. You're waiting your turn. And in contract law, that's really what's happening. It's signed, it's agreed to, but it's in progress. Hadn't happened. Natalie, you had your hand up.
Travis is executed contract and full performance, the same thing.
Well, they could be. Full performance is an example of an executed contract, but executed means closed, period. Contracts that are terminated are executed contracts. Whether they have been fully performed or not, they're closed out. Even if we have a mutual agreement to terminate, the contract is now what, folks? Executed. Because we're no longer what? Under contract. We don't no longer have an agreement. Does that help, Natalie? So it's the executed literally means done, over, finished. And generally speaking, it is very hard to sue somebody for an executed contract. What do you think a judge is going to say to you if you go up in court and you show up in there and the contract is over and closed and done and you're now suing for something other that was in the contract? What do you think the judge is going to say to you?
Yeah.
Get lost, kid.
Get out.
Why didn't you speak up? Why did you what?
Wait.
What? But not even more importantly, why did nobody force you to close? Why did you what?
Why'd you close?
Why'd you close? If you had a problem, you should have not what? Closed. You should have filed your lawsuit when this contract was still what?
Executory.
Executory. We could have helped you when this contract is executory. Why is that important in our world, folks? There is a golden rule in our world when it comes to closings. You better make sure that buyer is happy before they go sign that paperwork. You better make sure they got everything they were promised before they go sign that paperwork. And I don't mean the contract. I mean at the closing attorney's office. You better make sure they are satisfied that everything they were supposed to get, they have gotten before that closing takes place. Because the minute it's over, they have lost all right to file a lawsuit against that seller who didn't do anything. Because here's what the court's going to say. If you didn't like it, if you didn't think they had done what they were supposed to do, why did you what?
Close.
Why did you close? Why'd you accept it that way? Does everybody see why that's a very different point in time for us, executory versus executed? In our line of work, what kinds of contracts do we pretty much deal with? Do we deal with executed contracts or do we deal with executory contracts?
Executory.
Executory. Pretty much once contracts are executed, that's time for us to exit, ain't it?
Yep.
We gone. Our job's over. And if you think about it, closing represents the time that a lot of our contracts are executed, not just the contract between the buyer and the seller, but how about our agency agreements? What happens to those at closing?
Usually they're done.
They're executed as well, right? How about my contract to be paid from my office? That's also what?
Executory.
But it's going to be executed because they're going to do what?
Pay you.
They're going to pay me, right? That's what closing is. That's why it's called closing. Everything gets shut. It's too late to speak up after the fact then, in most cases. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. So, why do we do a final walkthrough with a buyer? Because once they bought it, it's theirs. Time to find out is before they bought it. Time to find out is before they close. That's what you do for your buyer clients. Now, you don't do that for buyer customers. Here's what you do for a buyer customer. Would you like to do a walkthrough? Oh, no? Okay. That's what you do for a buyer customer. Here's what you do for a buyer client. We're going to do a walkthrough. Meet me there. I don't care. Get there. And do you think you should have a list of things you ask the seller for with you handy when you do that walkthrough? Like if they've done any repairs, they've agreed to fix things. Do you think you should have that list handy with you?
Yes.
Walk the buyer through. Put their eyes on every single one of them. Are you okay with this? Are you okay with this? Are you okay with this? Would it probably even be a good idea to have some little, send a little email after you've walked through and say, thanks for walking through with me this morning. I'm so excited to see you at the closing attorney's office. As I understand it, all your concerns have been resolved and we're ready to go. Does that sound right to you? Even if they don't reply, would that be proof that you have given them the opportunity to speak now or forever hold your peace?
Yes.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. And here's the ugly truth. If you do that walkthrough and they find things you're not satisfied with, there's really only one way to make sure it gets taken care of. There's only one way to make sure it gets taken care of. What's the one way?
Extend the contract.
In other words, don't what?
Don't
Close.
Don't close. Don't
Delay.
close. I didn't say it was a good option. That's a crappy option for everybody, including the buyer in a lot of cases, because they may have all their life packed up on a U-Haul truck. But the only way to guarantee it gets done, I've had people say, that's not true. I've always just talked to the listing agent and the seller says they'll come back and they'll pick up their stuff out of the garage.
Mm-hmm.
They might, or they what?
Might not.
Or they might not. Good luck forcing them to after you close. My point is, if you want to guarantee that you have the legal right to enforce that contract and force them to close, you better keep that contract in what state?
Executory.
Executory state. Is everybody with me on that now? Because here's the first thing a judge is going to say when you hand them that contract. They're going to say, well, is this still under contract or have you closed? And you say, well, we closed 2 months ago. And they're going to say, well, I'm not sure what you want me to figure out then, because you've already, as far as the law is concerned, this agreement no longer exists. You executed this agreement. There's not much we can do to revive it. You killed it when you closed it. That's the difference between executory and executed. Are we all okay with that? So that takes us through 8.1, which is the major sort of introduction to terminology when it comes to contracts. Now,